For centuries, you have been handed a sanitized, post-Enlightenment illusion. You have been given a version of ancient history, stripped of its supernatural vitality, and reduced to polite, moralistic lessons. But the scriptures were not birthed in quiet monasteries or academic halls. They were forged in a terrifying matrix of divine warfare, cosmic rebellion, and mythological polemics. To truly understand the mysteries of these ancient texts, to elevate the discussion from casual debate to a rigorous and intellectually gripping reality, we have to plunge into the original languages, the forgotten extra-biblical scrolls, and the historical anomalies that have haunted theologians for millennia. There are lingering anomalies hidden in plain sight, anomalies that suggest the book you think you know is merely the surface of a deep, dark, mythological ocean. The narrative must immediately disabuse you of the notion that the biblical canon formed seamlessly, without leaving behind fragments of a much older and stranger reality. And beneath those waves lies the true story of the divine council, cosmic chaos, and eschatological judgment. The first fracture in the sanitized narrative appears early, hidden within a genealogical anomaly in the antediluvian lineage. We are introduced to a patriarch named Enoch, the seventh generation from Adam, who lived exactly 365 years before he simply vanished. The ancient text states coldly that he was not, for God took him. This remarkably brief mention in the book of Genesis serves as the nucleus for one of the most expansive, terrifying, and influential texts of Second Temple Judaism. The mystery of Enoch is not just his physical exemption from death, but the profound, almost dangerous reverence that early Christian and prominent Jewish sects held for the pseudepigraphal literature bearing his name. Deep in the arid desert, the ascetic Essene community at Qumran, the strict keepers of the Dead Sea Scrolls, guarded these Enochic traditions fiercely. They read First Enoch not as a mere fable, but as a vital cosmic blueprint. They utilized its complex solar calendar and its exhaustive, terrifying angelology to understand the true origins of cosmic evil. Early Christian writers, men like Tertullian and the author of the Epistle of Barnabas, treated these words with absolute scriptural authority, viewing its apocalyptic visions as foundational to their understanding of an impending, fiery judgment. But as the centuries bled on, a deliberate and methodical erasure began. The Book of Enoch was systematically excluded from the standardized canons of both Rabbinic Judaism and the Western Christian Church. The reasons for this exclusion were deeply theological and historical. Following the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70 CE, Rabbinic Judaism, deriving largely from first-century Phariseeism, sought to tightly consolidate its theological borders. They deliberately distanced themselves from the apocalyptic fervor and the dualistic angelology that the Essenes and early Christians championed. For the early Christian Church, the text of First Enoch became a formidable doctrinal nightmare. It spoke of an elaborate angelology and asserted that demons were actually the disembodied, wandering spirits of dead Nephilim giants. It presented a soteriology that bordered on forbidden esoteric knowledge, raising insurmountable red flags for emerging Orthodox dogma. Most dangerously, it attributed the corruption of humanity not primarily to the simple transgression of Adam in the garden, but to the deliberate, sinister descent of angelic beings known as the Watchers. This terrifying origin of sin conflicted heavily with the developing Augustinian theology of original sin. Ultimately, it was pushed into the shadows, preserved fully only by the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, who recognized its ancient Jewish roots and its profound influence on early Christian eschatology. Yet the ghost of Enoch could not be fully exorcised from the canonical text. The ultimate, undeniable tension regarding his forbidden visions is permanently embedded within the New Testament itself. In the short, explosive epistle of Jude, we find an explicit quotation of a prophecy attributed directly to Enoch, the seventh from Adam. This is no vague allusion or passing nod. It is a direct, calculated deployment of Enochic literature to establish massive theological precedent. Jude demonstrates unequivocally that first-century Jewish Christians viewed this tradition as carrying significant prophetic weight. Jude utilizes this quotation not necessarily to validate the entire Enochic corpus, but to draw a direct, terrifying parallel between the eschatological judgment of false teachers infiltrating the early church and the ancient, cosmic judgment pronounced upon the Watchers, the rebellious angelic beings who descended upon Mount Hermon. To fully grasp the magnitude of this, you have to look at the Greek text. Jude utilizes a nearly verbatim Greek translation of 1 Enoch chapter 1, verse 9, to declare an oracle of final judgment. He envisions the coming of the Lord with 10,000s of his holy ones as the imminent return of Jesus Christ to finalize a divine war against cosmic rebellion. By embedding this forbidden text into his letter, Jude anchors the New Testament's eschatological vision to an ancient narrative of angelic treason, forcing modern readers to confront a supernatural worldview that extends far beyond the safe boundaries of standard systematic theology. But who exactly were these Watchers, and what terrifying reality required God to drown the entire world in response? To understand why these ancient rebellious entities were cast into utter darkness, you must first unlearn the greatest theological misconception of the modern age. The post-Augustinian paradigm, the one whispered in Sunday schools and neatly printed in systematic theology textbooks, interprets ancient biblical mysteries through a purely human, moralistic lens. It is a safe, comfortable view. It is also completely wrong. It fails utterly to capture the terrifying, supernatural architecture of the Hebrew Bible. The ancient Israelites did not look up at the night sky and imagine a lonely, singular entity occupying an empty void. They looked up and saw a sprawling, unfathomable cosmic bureaucracy. They viewed Yahweh as the uncreated, supreme sovereign, yes, but a sovereign who presided over a vast, active assembly of lesser, created spiritual beings. This is the divine counsel. To step into the reality of Psalm 82 is to step into a cosmic courtroom, bathed in a light so absolute it would blind a mortal man. Imagine the sheer, crushing gravity of this divine assembly. The standard Western interpretation, desperate to protect a rigid, sanitized definition of monotheism, attempts to demythologize this terrifying text. They will tell you that the gods mentioned in this psalm are merely unjust human magistrates, corrupt Israelite judges, or arrogant earthly kings dressed in heavy robes. But the original Hebrew language strips away this comforting illusion. The ancient text reads, Elohim nitzav ba'adat el, bekerev Elohim yishpot. Translated with precise, chilling accuracy, it states that God, the singular, uncreated creator, stands in the divine assembly. And in the midst of the gods, the plural Elohim, he holds judgment. The poetic structure of the Hebrew text forms an inescapable trap for the modern skeptic. It uses a chiastic structure, an X pattern in Hebrew poetic parallelism, to unequivocally establish that these entities are not men. If they were human, the psalmist would be stating that mortals sit in the heavenly council, a theological absurdity. The word Elohim is not a title of omnipotence. It is a word of residence. It denotes any being whose proper habitation is the spiritual realm. Angels, demons, the disembodied dead, they are all Elohim. And on this day, the uncreated Creator steps into their midst to issue a sentence of doom. The tension in this cosmic courtroom is rooted in an ancient catastrophe, one that stretches back to the dust and confusion of the Tower of Babel. According to the theological framework hidden within Deuteronomy chapter 32, when humanity united in absolute, arrogant defiance, raising a tower to pierce the heavens, God did not simply scatter their languages. He enacted a terrifying cosmic disinheritance. As the smoke of human hubris choked the sky, Yahweh stepped back. He divided the nations of the earth according to the number of the sons of God. He placed these lesser Elohim, these divine administrators, over the 70 Gentile nations, leaving them to their own devices while reserving only a single, chosen bloodline for himself. But these divine administrators did not rule with justice. They drank in the worship of men. They demanded blood. They ruled with cruelty, corruption, and an iron fist, becoming the dark gods of the ancient world. Psalm 82 captures the exact, horrifying moment when Yahweh strips them of their divine privilege. You can almost hear the thunder of his voice echoing against the pillars of heaven as he brings formal charges against these beings. He tells them, "I said you are gods, but you shall die like men." He sentences immortal spiritual entities to a terrifying mortal expiration. But the corruption of the nations was merely a symptom of a much deeper, more visceral violation of the cosmic order. With the reality of the divine council firmly established, we must turn to the most bizarre and misunderstood passage in the book of Genesis. Chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. The mystery of the Nephilim. For centuries, theologians like St. Augustine championed the Sethite view, a desperate attempt to clean up a messy, supernatural narrative. They argued that the sons of God were merely righteous human men, the descendants of Seth, who made the mistake of marrying the wicked human daughters of Cain. It is a neat, tidy explanation of believers marrying unbelievers. But it is a lie born of theological fear. In the Old Testament, the exact phrase B'nai Elohim is utilized exclusively to denote divine angelic beings. They are the ones who present themselves before Yahweh's throne in the book of Job. They are the ones who shouted for joy at the dawn of creation, long before human lungs existed to draw breath. The Nephilim event was not a simple sin of human lust. It was the ultimate, horrifying transgression of cosmic boundaries. Imagine the descent. The Watchers, a specific and highly militant faction of angelic beings, standing at the precipice of the spiritual realm, looking down upon the daughters of men. They did not just observe, they coveted. They abandoned their heavenly habitation. They willingly stripped away their purely spiritual nature, pushing through the veil of reality to mingle with the heavy, pulsing reality of human flesh. The physical sensation of pure energy translating into bone, muscle, and blood must have been agonizing, a deliberate defilement of their created purpose. They took human wives, and the resulting offspring were not mere men. They were the Nephilim. The Greek Septuagint translates this word as gigantes, giants, but they were so much worse than that. They were unnatural, hybrid abominations. This was a highly strategic biological incursion. The rebellious divine beings sought to corrupt the human genome itself, to usurp the Creator's design, and to establish themselves as literal, walking demigods ruling over the earth. The widespread, terrifying mythology of giants and demigods that haunts ancient Mediterranean and Mesopotamian cultures is not the product of vivid imaginations. It is the suppressed, traumatized cultural memory of this exact pre-flood incursion. When you understand the Nephilim as the monstrous, towering byproducts of angelic rebellion, consuming everything in their path and threatening the very survival of the unadulterated human race, the apocalyptic horror of the Great Flood finally makes sense. The earth was not drowned out of mere divine frustration. It was an act of cosmic chemotherapy. The globe had to be purged under millions of tons of crushing water to eradicate a corrupted, hybrid bloodline that threatened to devour humanity itself. The waters of the Great Flood eventually receded, leaving a scoured, suffocated earth in their wake, a graveyard of giants buried beneath miles of compressed mud. But if you believe the cleansing of the earth meant the end of the cosmic war, you have gravely underestimated the resilience of the dark Elohim. The lesser Elohim, now unleashed upon their assigned territories, established dark, blood-soaked religions across the ancient Near East. Humanity was swallowed by the darkness, worshipping the very entities that sought to destroy them. It is within this chaotic, fractured landscape that the biblical narrative pushes further into the deep antiquity of the primordial world. To articulate God's absolute sovereignty over a universe that seemed to be tearing itself apart at the seams, the ancient authors turned to the terrifying imagery of primordial beasts and the chaotic ocean. This brings us face to face with the most misunderstood creatures in the entire biblical canon: the massive, earth-shaking behemoth and the twisting, fire-breathing terror of the deep, known as Leviathan. The ancient world, after the collapse of the Babel Tower, was a terrifying landscape of spiritual predators, a fractured reality where humanity was handed over to the dark administrators of the divine council. But to understand how the ancient Israelites conceptualized the absolute, terrifying sovereignty of their uncreated Creator over this chaotic nightmare, we have to strip away centuries of sanitized, modern scientific assumptions. When we open the book of Job and arrive at its dramatic, earth-shattering climax, Yahweh does not answer Job's agonizing, bleeding questions with a polite, philosophical defense of divine justice. He answers out of a violent, tearing whirlwind that threatens to rip the flesh from Job's bones. He confronts a broken man sitting in ashes with the sheer, incomprehensible terror of two primordial entities, Behemoth and Leviathan. For decades, fundamentalist creationists and hyper-literal modernists have desperately attempted to shrink these cosmic horrors down to the safe, digestible size of a children's biology textbook. They will look you in the eye and argue that Behemoth was merely a surviving brachiosaurus eating leaves from the treetops, and that Leviathan was nothing more than a mosasaurus swimming in the shallow Mediterranean. This is a tragic, almost comical modern anachronism. It entirely misses the profound, aggressive theological warfare occurring in the ancient text. To the ancient Israelite mind, Leviathan, a name derived from an ancient root word meaning to coil or to twist, was not a biological reptile waiting patiently to be fossilized in sedimentary rock. Leviathan was a deeply embedded cultural symbol. It was the ultimate terrifying manifestation of primordial cosmic chaos, a beast that haunted the darkest nightmares of the ancient world. To truly grasp the horror of Leviathan, you must wade into the broader ancient Near Eastern literary motif known to modern scholars as the Chaos Kampf, the eternal, bloody struggle against chaos. Across the dark mythologies of the Mediterranean and Mesopotamia, the act of creation itself was never a peaceful, orderly event. It was always depicted as a hyper-violent cosmic war where a supreme warrior deity had to physically butcher a massive, multi-headed sea dragon representing the untamed, destructive, and suffocating forces of the primordial ocean. In the Babylonian epic, the Enuma Elish, the storm god Marduk slaughters the chaotic sea goddess Tiamat, physically splitting her massive, pulsating, blood-drenched corpse in half to construct the vault of the heavens and the foundation of the earth. But the biblical authors were targeting something much closer to home. Hidden in the ruins of the ancient city of Ugarit, the Canaanite Baal cycle describes the storm god Baal-Hadad battling a terrifying, seven-headed, twisting sea serpent named Lotan. In a staggering, undeniable linguistic parallel, Lotan is the exact Ugaritic phonetic equivalent of the Hebrew word Leviathan. The biblical authors did not write their scriptures in a sterile cultural vacuum. They deliberately co-opted this widely understood, terrifying mythological imagery, completely nativizing it to prove Yahweh's ultimate, unrivaled supremacy over the elements. When the psalmist declares that Yahweh divided the heavy, crushing sea by his infinite might and physically crushed the multiple, snapping heads of Leviathan, leaving its ruined, floating corpse on the waters as food for the creatures of the wilderness, it is a deliberate, aggressive theological flex against the surrounding pagan nations. It is a deafening declaration that it is not the Canaanite Baal or the Babylonian Marduk who masters the chaos of the universe. It is Yahweh alone. When Yahweh speaks out of the raging whirlwind in the 41st chapter of Job, describing Leviathan as a creature that breathes literal, consuming fire, possesses impenetrable, double-plated armor that repels iron like straw, and leaves a wake of glowing, boiling foam in the crushing depths of the abyss, he is not giving Job a sterile zoological lecture. He is making a majestic, terrifying declaration of absolute dominance. He is stating that he alone can tame the ultimate manifestation of chaotic evil. The sheer heat of the beast's breath vaporizes millions of gallons of salt water in an instant, and the sound of its roar vibrates through the tectonic plates of the earth. Yet Yahweh's power is so absolute, so infinitely supreme, that he eventually turns this fearsome, multi-headed monster of the deep into a mere plaything. The chaotic ocean, the dark, crushing abyss that terrified the ancient mind and swallowed ships whole, is nothing but a sandbox for the Creator. And the prophet Isaiah takes this terrifying Chaos Kampf motif and points it directly toward the eschatological future like a loaded weapon. He promises that at the very end of time, God will draw his great, cruel, and mighty sword from its heavenly sheath to finally, permanently slay the twisting serpent in the sea. This execution marks the ultimate, bloody destruction of cosmic chaos and the painful birth of a perfected, orderly new world. This terrifying display of divine supremacy over the forces of chaos leads us inevitably back to the man who was confronted by the whirlwind in the first place, revealing a final, massive anomaly that rewrites the history of the ancient world. The Book of Job is universally recognized as a towering, unapproachable masterpiece of human suffering, a text that grapples with the profound complexities of agony and divine sovereignty. But its actual historical placement and authorship are shrouded in deep linguistic anomalies that have frustrated and baffled modern academics for generations. The traditional, comforting Sunday school timeline paints Job as a simple, wealthy, patient nomad sitting in the dirt long before the law of Moses was ever carved into stone. But the Hebrew utilized in the prose sections of the book is highly strange and anomalous. It is not the classical, poetic, biblical Hebrew characteristic of the Davidic monarchic era, nor is it the standard, rigid, post-exilic Hebrew found in books like Ezra or Nehemiah. It is a strange, localized dialect, heavily infected with Aramaic influence, featuring rare, jagged lexemes and syntactic constructions that point strongly to an Edomite or Transjordanian origin. Yet the internal events pulse with the ancient, raw rhythm of the patriarchal period. Job measures his massive, sprawling wealth entirely in breathing, bleeding livestock, counting thousands of sheep, camels, and oxen, rather than in standardized, stamped silver coinage. He acts as an autonomous high priest for his own family, offering bloody, burnt sacrifices in the desert dirt, a practice that clearly predates the strict establishment of the Levitical priesthood. Furthermore, his massive estate is subjected to sudden, hyper-violent raids by ancient, opportunistic, nomadic tribes, specifically the Sabaeans and Chaldeans, situating the narrative in a brutal era of tribal, pastoral nomadism. The most fascinating and paradigm-shattering anomaly regarding Job's true identity is not found in the standard pages of the Hebrew Bible, but is hidden in plain sight as a highly specific, ancient addition tacked on to the very end of the Greek Septuagint translation. Chapter 42, verse 17 in the ancient Greek text contains a detailed historical postscript, purportedly translated from an older, lost Syriac book. This addendum does not describe Job as a mere wealthy farmer who fell upon a string of incredibly bad luck. It explicitly and boldly identifies him as Jobab ben Zerah, the second king of the ancient, bloodthirsty nation of Edom, mentioned in the royal genealogy of Genesis 36. The text states with startling, cold specificity that he dwelt in the land of Uz, on the borders of Edom and Arabia, that his name before was Jobab, and that he was descended directly from Esau, making him the fifth generation from Abraham. If this ancient textual tradition is accurate, and it was widely accepted by the early church fathers and is still present in Eastern Orthodox traditions today, it completely revolutionizes everything you thought you knew about the story. Job was royalty. He was a supreme, powerful Edomite king. Imagine the transition from an opulent, heavily guarded palace smelling of sweet myrrh and roasted meats, to sitting completely alone on a smoldering, toxic ash heap outside the city gates. Imagine the sheer agony of using a broken, jagged piece of dirty pottery to scrape the putrid, oozing boils that completely covered his skin. The smell of his own rotting flesh filling his nostrils. His sudden catastrophic fall from grace, his agonizing physical rot, and his absolute loss of power sent massive geopolitical shockwaves across the entire ancient Near East. It suddenly explains why his three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, who were themselves deeply entrenched regional elites and rulers, traveled across brutal, unforgiving desert landscapes. They did not come merely to comfort a sad friend. They came as foreign dignitaries to hold court with a fallen rival, to assess the power vacuum left by a king cursed by the gods. Job's ultimate restoration was not just the return of a few stolen camels. It was the miraculous reinstatement of a sovereign monarch, granted an additional 140 years of life, double the standard allocation of his era. He stands as a towering figure of historical endurance, a king who stared into the twisting, chaotic maw of Leviathan and lived to see the dawn. But the cosmic war that Job witnessed from the ashes, the war that began with the treason of the Watchers and the drowning of the Nephilim, was far from over. It was marching relentlessly toward a final apocalyptic conclusion, a terrifying event that would require the ultimate, unthinkable descent into the deepest, darkest prison in the known universe. The ancient Apostles' Creed professes a deeply mysterious, almost uncomfortable doctrine that states, after Jesus was crucified, he descended into hell. For centuries, theologians have debated the nature of this descent, known as the harrowing of hell, with some arguing it was merely a metaphorical description of his agonizing spiritual suffering on the cross. But the linguistic keys to unlocking this ultimate mystery bypass the safe debates of modern theology and tie the crucifixion directly back to the terrifying angelic rebellion of the Watchers. In his epistles, the Apostle Peter uses an unprecedented, chilling linguistic choice to describe exactly where the Spirit of Christ went while his physical body lay cold and bleeding in the tomb. Peter does not use the Hebrew word Sheol, representing the common grave, nor does he use the Greek word Hades, the underworld of human souls, nor even Gehenna, the place of final fiery destruction. Instead, he uses a word found only once in the entire Greek New Testament, the verb tartarou, meaning literally to cast down to Tartarus. In the dark ancient mythologies of the Greek world, Tartarus was not a place for mortal men. It was the deepest, darkest, most suffocating abyss of the underworld, a subterranean prison of torment reserved exclusively for the Titans, the ancient, rebellious gods who were defeated and bound in heavy chains. By deliberately co-opting this highly specific mythological term, Peter aligns the chained Titans with the fallen Watchers of the Enochic tradition, the divine architects of the Genesis rebellion who abandoned their cosmic station to breed the unnatural Nephilim. Therefore, Christ's descent into the crushing blackness of the earth was not a post-mortem evangelism crusade for deceased humans who missed their chance at salvation. It was a terrifying, brilliant cosmic victory lap. Imagine the blinding, uncreated light of the Savior piercing the absolute, eternal darkness of Tartarus. He walked past the massive, bound forms of the rebellious Elohim, entities that had once sought to usurp the throne of heaven and corrupt the bloodline of humanity. He stood before the chained architects of cosmic chaos to declare that their ancient, desperate attempt to thwart the lineage of the Messiah had definitively, permanently failed. The cross was not a defeat. It was the absolute, irrevocable sealing of their doom, a violent restoration of the cosmic order that shattered the spiritual authority of the rebel council forever. But while the cosmic war was definitively won in the abyss, the localized earthly battle raged on the surface, culminating in the most terrifying and hotly debated mystery in the biblical canon, the Book of Revelation. The text is a labyrinthine sensory overload of multi-headed beasts rising from the Black Sea, and apocalyptic judgments poured out from golden bowls. Modern futurists look ahead to a coming global Antichrist, but the historical preterist interpretation provides a much more chilling and intellectually rigorous context for the book's composition. Revelation was not written as an esoteric, floating crystal ball for Christians living 2 millennia later in comfortable suburbs. It was urgent, desperate, underground resistance literature written for first-century believers facing absolute, visceral annihilation at the hands of the Roman Empire. To survive under the crushing weight of imperial surveillance and paranoia, the Apostle John utilized a highly sophisticated apocalyptic code, drawing upon ancient prophetic imagery to communicate messages of hope and doom without triggering the immediate, bloody execution of his readers. The terrifying beasts and dragons of the text were not abstract futuristic metaphors. To the early church, enduring visceral trauma, the bloodthirsty Roman emperor, specifically the tyrannical Nero, was the literal, breathing incarnation of the beast, a sadistic puppet animated directly by the cosmic dragon, the chaotic force of Leviathan. To speak out against him openly in a letter was a guaranteed death sentence. Therefore, Revelation was written in heavy code because it was dangerous, radical treason. The apocalyptic imagery was a desperate assurance to the persecuted believers that despite the horrors of the Colosseum and the apparent crushing omnipotence of Rome, the sovereign God of the divine council would ultimately shatter the empire, cast the beast into the lake of fire, and permanently vindicate the blood of the martyrs. To truly understand the deepest mysteries of the biblical text requires you to discard the modern, sanitized overlays you have been spoon-fed your entire life. You must commit to reading the narrative through the terrifying, awe-inspiring eyes of its ancient authors. It is a worldview where the veil between the physical dirt of the earth and the blinding supernatural realm is terrifyingly thin. A reality where human history is inextricably linked to violent divine warfare. The bizarre anomalies of the text, the towering giants, the twisting sea dragons, the immortal priests walking out of the desert shadows, and the cryptic numbers of empire, they are not errors or contradictions. They are the structural, architectural pillars of a unified cosmic drama. The descent of the Watchers explains the monstrous nature of the Nephilim and the catastrophic necessity of the global flood. The ancient Chaos Kampf reveals Leviathan not as a dinosaur, but as the primordial manifestation of chaos that only the uncreated Creator possesses the power to subdue. The unthinkable descent into the mythological depths of Tartarus reveals the ultimate victory over the rebellious divine council. And the terrifying Book of Revelation serves as the capstone of this entire cosmic war, proving that the grotesque persecution under Nero Caesar was merely the localized, earthly manifestation of a spiritual rebellion that began millennia prior. The Bible is not a safe collection of disjointed moral fables. It is a highly sophisticated, encoded, and historically grounded record of a cosmic war, a war that culminates in the violent annihilation of chaos, the final judgment of rebellious divine beings, and the eternal restoration of divine order. We spend our entire lives terrified of the dark. We desperately fight the chaos of our own internal leviathans, begging the universe for a quiet, predictable calm. But the haunting irony of this ancient cosmic war is that the ultimate peace wasn't forged in the safety of the light. The Savior of the universe didn't defeat the rebellion by staying on a golden throne. He had to willingly plunge his hands into the suffocating, chained blackness of Tartarus. The monster, the primordial chaos, the crushing, agonizing weight of the Roman beast, they were all necessary. They were the brutal anvils upon which the eternal kingdom had to be hammered into existence. The light didn't just passively banish the dark. It invaded it, weaponized it, and used the shadows to prove its own absolute supremacy. You spend your days building your own safe little towers of Babel. You try to control every single variable of your fragile life, terrified of the chaotic waters, terrified of the monsters lurking in the deep trench of your own mind. You have been sold the lie that true peace is simply the absence of the storm. But look at the blood-soaked cosmic reality of the ancient text. Do you choose the fragile, anxious peace of a sanitized, highly controlled illusion? Or do you embrace the terrifying, violent storm of reality, where true sovereignty is actually forged? The cosmic war of the ancient scrolls may be settled, but the dark Elohim are not dead. They have simply changed their names and hidden themselves within the algorithms and empires of our modern world. To see where the architects of chaos are operating today, you need to be prepared to look into the abyss. Subscribe to the Watcher's Archives if you are brave enough to witness the next chapter.